The snow came down in slow, heavy flakes, thick enough to smother sound, blanketing the crooked rails and weather-beaten platform of the Mercy Station rail yard. Dusk sagged against the horizon, bleeding the last of the color from the day. In that desolate hour, a thin girl stood alone by a splintered wooden crate marked in faded, stenciled paint, "Orphan Train, Westbound." Her hair, dark and tangled, clung to her cheeks in damp strands. Her face was hollow, skin the pallor of old paper, and her feet, bare, blue from cold, pressed against the snowpack until it crusted around her ankles like ice shackles. She could have been 8, though thinness and hardship made ages lie. The cold didn't creep into her bones. It had already claimed them. A whistle shrieked through the stillness, splitting the air like a blade. The train exhaled a plume of white steam that rolled across the platform in ghostly tendrils. Through the mist, a woman in a wool shawl hurried to board, pausing at the carriage steps. Her eyes met the child's for the briefest instant. A flicker of recognition? Regret? The woman's gloved hand tightened around her bag's handle, and she turned away without a word, disappearing into the warmth of the departing train. Steam swallowed the girl's face. The massive black engine rumbled to life, wheels grinding against frozen tracks. The child's hand, small and raw, let slip a scrap of dirty cloth, frayed at the edges, with one word stitched in crooked, childish letters: Clara. A stray dog, ribs sharp beneath its mangy coat, circled warily. The girl knelt stiffly, placing a trembling hand on its mottled side. The dog did not bolt. Her fingers, near numb, brushed the animal's flank as her bleeding feet pressed deeper into the packed snow. A few yards down the platform, Mr. Calvin Dross, a thick-shouldered man in a wool coat gone greasy at the cuffs, counted heads with a grim impatience. Orphan train children clustered in 2s and 3s near the doors, eyes downcast. Dross clicked his tongue, lips moving silently with the numbers. At the end of his count, a scowl twisted his face. "One missing," he muttered, peering over his shoulder toward the emptying platform. Snowflakes drifted across the deserted space. He caught sight of the girl's outline near the crate. A breath of annoyance escaped him. One less mouth to feed. He shrugged, and turned back to the warmth of the train car. Inside, through a frostbitten window, an older boy with a shock of uncombed hair pressed his hand to the glass. Eli. His fingers left a brief print in the frost. He watched as the thin silhouette of the barefoot girl blurred and shrank, swallowed by the distance, a shape dissolving into mist and falling snow. His lips parted, as if to call out, but no sound came. The snow thickened. Fat flakes clung to the girl's lashes, settled on her bare shoulders, turning her hair to icy threads. The wind knifed through the station yard. Her lips had gone the color of river stones. Her bare feet, already split and crusted with frost, sank fractionally with each passing moment into the frozen crust beneath her. From the darkened freight office, an elderly station hand, Lemuel, watched. His cap sat askew, tufts of gray hair clinging to his weathered scalp. His watery eyes, narrowed against the white squall, tracked the small figure by the crate. He took a step toward the door, fingers fumbling at the latch, then stopped. Fear clung to men like Lemuel, and fear of Mr. Dross was a heavy thing. His hand fell to his side. He turned away. The last cold train of the night hissed at the far end of the yard, lanterns bobbing, an iron serpent preparing to pull into the cold dark. From its belly, a tall figure stepped down from the cab, boots crunching against the ice. A man swathed in soot-stained overcoat and scarf, his skin wind-roughened, eyes narrowed against the storm. Grady Holt. Few knew his name. Fewer still spoke it. The girl did not notice him at first. She was watching the snow, her mind drifting to warmth she could no longer remember. But something in the stillness changed. A presence. Grady's gaze settled on her, unwavering. He took one step, then another. The storm gusted, lifting the hem of his coat. Inside, stitched to the lining, a small, silver cross glinted briefly in the dying light. He knelt before her, the snow rising around them like a curtain. No words, no sharp intake of breath, no theatrical declarations of rescue or pity. He simply removed his gloves, calloused, oil-smudged hands weathered by years of labor, and pressed them over her frozen fingers, enclosing them like the last ember of a dying fire. She did not cry. No tears left to shed, but her eyes lifted, gray as the storm-tossed sky, and met his. In them, the dull reflection of a world long lost. Grady saw it, and something ancient stirred behind his ribs. He stood. In one motion, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her. The warmth of it, carrying the scent of coal smoke and iron, sagged heavy on her shoulders. Without ceremony, he bent, lifted her into his arms, her body light as an empty pail. The girl's head settled against his chest. The world beyond the storm seemed to tilt, drawing them away from the empty platform. He carried her past the darkened station sign Mercy, letters barely visible beneath a crust of ice, toward a single lantern glow in the distant dark. No one stopped him. No voice called out. No lawman questioned his right. And in the snow-heavy night, as the last whistle echoed away into the hills, the girl vanished from the rail yard forever, and Mercy Station returned to silence. The house stood where the tracks curved westward, a lone clapboard structure with its paint weathered to gray by wind and seasons. Its windows were frosted over, the glass rimed with tiny webs of ice that caught the pale light like old lace. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney, the only thing moving in a world otherwise hushed beneath heavy snow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning oak and something stewing on the stove. Mabel Holt stood at the doorway, a wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her hair, dark and streaked with gray, hung in a loose braid over one shoulder. Her hands were raw and red from scrubbing clothes in ice water earlier that day. She watched the snow-swallowed path without blinking, and then she saw them. Grady Holt, her husband of 20 years, appeared from the storm's edge. The storm gnawed at the hem of his coat, but he moved as though the cold meant nothing. In his arms, a bundle of cloth and bone, a child limp against his chest. Bare feet dangled, skin the pale hue of stone, dark with dried blood and frostbite. Mabel's lips parted, but no sound came. She stepped aside without a word. Grady crossed the threshold, the warmth of the room rising to meet them, the door swinging closed behind him with a hollow thud. He crouched beside the fire, lowering the girl onto a woolen blanket Mabel had already spread across the floor. Without needing to be told, Mabel fetched a basin of water, dipping a torn piece of linen into the warmth. Steam rose in ghostly tendrils as she knelt beside the girl. The child did not flinch, did not speak, her eyes fixed on the flickering yellow of the fire as though it alone tethered her to the world. Mabel's fingers brushed over the girl's feet, raw, cracked, split open in places. She worked slowly, gently dabbing away blood and ice, murmuring nothing. It wasn't tenderness exactly. It was older than tenderness, a sort of obligation that spoke through the hands when words had long since dried up. Grady stood by the doorway, shedding his gloves and boots. He set them beside the fire without sound. His face, smudged with coal soot and framed by graying stubble, was hard to read in the dimness. The fire cast long shadows against the walls. On the mantel above it, a faded photograph leaned in a simple wood frame, the image of a boy, 10 or so, grinning in the stiff, self-conscious way of old tintypes. Silas. Mabel's eyes flicked to it once and quickly away. She fetched bread, tearing it into a bowl of thin broth. She placed it before the girl, who reached out, her small fingers trembling so fiercely that the spoon clattered against the wood. She managed to dip the bread and lift it to her mouth. Outside, the wind rose in sudden fury, rattling the windows. Snow struck the glass in soft, relentless waves. The world beyond shrank, as though the storm itself meant to erase everything except the room and the 3 souls inside it. Grady pulled a chair close to the fire, easing down into it with a sigh that wasn't weariness so much as the sound of a man letting something ancient settle on his shoulders. His voice, rough from years of coal smoke and cold, came low but steady. "You sleep here tonight." The girl's head moved, a small nod. No word came from her lips. Her gaze stayed on the flames, her face expressionless, though her shoulders eased a fraction beneath the heavy wool blanket. The hours crawled. Mabel cleared the basin, wrung out the cloth, laid another log on the fire. She fetched an old quilt from a chest in the corner, faded to near white with time. When she knelt to tuck it around the girl's small form, she noticed something clutched in the child's grip, a scrap of cloth, filthy and frayed, a name stitched crookedly in faded thread. Mabel bent closer. Clara. She mouthed the name to herself. It sat strange in her mouth, a name from some other world, some other child. But when she smoothed the girl's matted hair back from her brow, something flickered alive inside her, a long-buried instinct, fragile as moth wings. She turned down the lamp until the room softened into darkness, the fire's glow licking gently at the walls. Grady was already outside by then, leaning against the porch rail, the snow piling against his boots. He lit his pipe with numb fingers, watching the endless dark where the Orphan train had vanished into the hills. The storm covered its tracks already, as though it had never passed through Mercy. His mind drifted to a place he seldom let it go, a winter battlefield, bodies strewn across frozen ground, steam rising from spilled blood, a boy's body, face turned to the falling snow. A promise he'd never spoken but had carried all these years, something etched into marrow and muscle. Inside, Clara lay still, the fire warming her small hands. Sleep came gradually, and in it, memories she couldn't fully hold. A woman's voice humming a hymn beneath church rafters, ribbons in her hair the color of red clay, a warm hand pressing against her back in a crowd. Mabel watched her chest rise and fall. She wiped at her eyes once, hard, then busied herself with folding linens that didn't need folding. The wind screamed once more at the windows, but it couldn't reach them. And in that small house beside the tracks, 3 hearts beat in uneasy accord. A child left in the snow, a man who carried her, and a woman who, without knowing why, had set out a blanket by the fire before she ever saw them coming. Morning broke pale and gray, the kind of dawn where even the trees seemed to shrink beneath the weight of snow. The wind had stilled for a time, leaving the world muffled and breathless, as though the earth itself were waiting for something to begin, or perhaps to end. The house by the tracks sat still beneath its weight of white. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, curling into the dead sky. Inside, the warmth clung to the walls like a stubborn thing. Mabel moved quietly about the kitchen, her fingers working dough into rough shapes. Clara sat on a stool nearby, watching the older woman's hands, tracing the rhythm of each movement as though it were a language she was trying to learn. Then came the knock. It wasn't the gentle kind. It was the hard, impatient rap of a man who came expecting to be obeyed. The kind of knock that didn't ask for permission so much as announced itself. Mabel stiffened, her fingers tightening around the flour-dusted cloth. Grady, who'd been tending to kindling by the hearth, straightened and crossed to the door. Outside stood Mr. Calvin Dross, the storm's aftermath clinging to his shoulders. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing eyes sharp and cold as fence nails. Beside him, 2 town men shifted awkwardly, bundled against the morning chill, their faces marked by discomfort rather than conviction. Dross wasted no time. "I'm here for the stray," he said, his voice a rasp too loud for the hush of the morning. "Orphan girl. She was left behind last night. Station master said a man carried her off this way." Grady said nothing. He met Dross's gaze and let the silence stretch, a thing thick and unyielding as the snow at their feet. The town men exchanged glances, something uneasy passing between them. Dross sneered, taking a step forward. "Law says she's ward of the county. Got papers." He patted his coat pocket, though whether there was paper inside or not no one would say. "Ain't your place, Holt?" Before Grady could move, Mabel appeared at his side. She stood without flinching, her arms crossed, a smear of flour on her cheek. Her voice, when it came, was low and sure. "There's no one here for you." Dross's eyes darted past them to the house's lone front window. Behind the threadbare curtain, a small pale face peered out. "Clara." The hem of the curtain trembled as she quickly withdrew from sight. Dross's gaze dropped, catching sight of a long, narrow scar that cut across the back of Grady's hand. An old mark, pale and ropey. A soldier's scar. The memory of that war still hung heavy in the county, and Dross, for all his bluster, recognized the kind of man Grady had once been. He hesitated. "I'll have the law at your door by sundown." Dross spat, though some of the iron had drained from his words. Grady said nothing. His silence had weight, heavier than any shouted threat. It settled on the three men, like a stone on the chest. One of the town men, a wiry fellow named Arlen Pike, cleared his throat, shuffling his boots in the snow. He leaned toward Dross and muttered just loud enough to carry. "Best leave Holt be, Cal. Ain't no good comes of tangling with a man like him." The other man, barely older than a boy, nodded, eyes never quite meeting Grady's. A thin curtain of snow began to fall again, dusting shoulders and hats. The men's outlines softened against the white. Reluctantly, Dross stepped back. He fixed Grady with a final, lingering glare, one that promised more than it could deliver. Then he turned, his coat snapping in the wind, and trudged away, his boots leaving shallow prints behind him. The others followed, shoulders hunched. Clara vanished from the window. Grady watched them go until they were swallowed by distance and falling snow. Then he moved to the tracks, knelt down, and ran a calloused hand over the fresh footprints before the storm could erase them. He knew they'd be back. Men like Dross didn't leave matters unfinished. But for now, the quiet held. That night, under the weight of that uneasy peace, Grady set to work in the loft. By lamplight, he fashioned a small bed from scrap wood and old woolen quilts, the kind of place a child could nest into without fear of being moved along. Mabel sat by the hearth, mending an old dress. The fabric was faded but sturdy, the stitching strong where her fingers moved. Neither spoke of what they were doing, no words of keeping or staying, but something passed between them in glances and small gestures, a silent agreement older than vows, as natural as breath. In the days that followed, Clara's face began to change. The deep, constant flinch in her eyes softened. The wariness didn't vanish, but it receded, leaving room for other things. Once, while gathering eggs from the henhouse, Grady caught the ghost of a smile flicker across her face. Small, uncertain, but it was there. In the barn, Grady showed her a crippled pigeon, its wing twisted wrong. He said nothing as he knelt and gently set the bone, binding it with a sliver of splint and a torn strip of cloth. Clara knelt beside him, watching his hands, her breath catching in the cold. She didn't ask if the bird would fly again. Grady didn't promise it would. Mabel began teaching her to sew. The needle in Clara's hand shook at first, pricking her thumb more often than not. But each stitch she laid was a quiet rebellion against the world outside, a small, stubborn act of belonging. At the long table by the window, the three of them shared supper. Salt pork and root vegetables, bread thick with lard. No grace spoken aloud, though Mabel always bowed her head for a moment before taking the first bite. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind hummed at the window panes. They were a family by accident, by need, and slowly, without anyone naming it, by choice. Weeks passed. The snows that had once buried Mercy and the endless country beyond began to recede, bleeding away beneath a pale, hesitant sun. Patches of brown earth surfaced, like old wounds. The brittle grass lay flattened, uncertain whether to rise again. Along the river, the ice cracked and broke with the thaw, sheets of it groaning and sliding free, carried downstream toward some place neither road nor rail could reach. At the house by the tracks, life moved with the slow, steady pulse of the land itself. The days stretched a little longer. Smoke thinned from the chimney, and Grady left his coat unbuttoned. Mabel hung laundry on the line for the first time in months, though the wind still bit at her hands. Word spread in town, as it always did in places too small to swallow their secrets. Whispers passed in mercantile aisles, in pews on Sundays, in low voices over fence rails. Grady Holt took in that orphan girl the train left behind. Some spoke it with pity, some with contempt, most with the wary detachment of people grateful it wasn't their burden. Mr. Calvin Dross, hearing the murmur, returned with a new weapon, the law. It was near sundown when he arrived, this time not with a pair of uneasy town men, but with the town constable, Abram Kittredge. Abram was a man of lean frame and gray eyes, his face marked by years of choosing battles not always his own. He was neither cruel nor bold, but there was a weight to him, like a tree that refused to topple no matter how fierce the wind. Grady was sitting on the porch, a mug of black coffee cradled in his rough hands. The horizon stretched wide behind him, washed in the pale blue of an early spring sky. Abram took the step up onto the porch without ceremony. He, too, carried a mug and sat down beside Grady without waiting to be invited. Dross stood below, his anger thick in the air, but neither man gave him more than a glance. The wind rattled the bare branches overhead. Minutes passed in quiet. They drank their coffee, the only sound the distant, lazy call of a bird returning too soon. Finally, Abram spoke. His voice was low, worn. "You know she's theirs by law." Grady didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the place where the tracks disappeared into the west. "She's ours by right," he answered, his voice rough as gravel. No one said anything after that. Abram finished his coffee, set the mug down beside his boot, and stood. He nodded once, not agreement, not approval, but understanding. Then he walked back toward town. Dross cursed under his breath, threw a bitter glance at Grady, and followed, the two of them vanishing down the long, rutted road. A day later, the town's preacher came calling. Mabel met him at the door, wiped her hands on her apron, and invited him in with the weary grace of a woman long practiced in politeness to men she did not trust. She served him a slice of apple pie and poured coffee without asking. While he sat trying to stitch together small talk, Mabel let him see Clara seated in the corner, a tattered Bible in her lap, mouthing the words of a psalm in halting rhythm. The preacher watched a long while, said nothing, finished his pie, tipped his hat, and left. Grady taught Clara to set a snare in the woods behind the house, showed her how to track the faint imprints of rabbit feet in frost-hardened ground, how to read the crooked breaks in twigs, the telltale scatter of leaves. She moved quietly now, light as breath, her eyes sharp and steady. Spring came not all at once, but in fits and starts. The land softened in patches. The river swelled with the melt. Some nights still carried frost, but each morning more green dared to show. Clara's feet, once torn and bloodied, grew stronger on the damp earth. In the barn, the crippled pigeon Grady had splinted months before found its wings again. One soft, blue-gray morning, Clara opened the coop door and watched it rise, awkward at first, then sure. It cut a wide arc across the sky, over the river, beyond the trees, and disappeared into the pale blue. She stood long after it was gone. There was one last visit. Dross came alone, near dusk. No lawman this time. No town men. The snow was gone, mud thick along the road's edge, frogs beginning to sing in the low marsh. Mabel met him in the yard. He offered money first. A heavy purse, the coins clinking as he opened it. Said it was more than fair. Said a girl like that would only bring them trouble down the line. Mabel didn't touch it, didn't even look at it. He made his threats next. Promised the sheriff, promised the judge, promised to drag them into court before summer. And then Grady stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He carried nothing, but something in the way he stood emptied the words from Dross's throat. The two men locked eyes, and what Dross saw then made his blood go cold. There was no promise of violence, no anger, only something ancient, something that had endured war and loss, and would endure Dross just the same. The wind stirred the grass. The frogs sang. Dross swallowed, stepped back, and left without another word. The sun dropped lower, painting the world in hues of gold and ash. On the porch, Clara sat between Grady and Mabel, a comb in her lap. Mabel braided the girl's hair, her fingers deft, tugging gently as she worked. Grady sipped his coffee. "You sleep in this home as long as breath's in me," he said, the words quiet, unshaken. Clara smiled. A real thing this time. Not a flicker. Not a ghost. A full, steady light. Behind them, the storm had passed. The world beyond still cruel, still sharp in its edges, but held at bay for one more day. From far away, a train whistle sounded, thin and mournful. Another orphan train. Another child left behind, or carried too far. Clara turned her face to the sound. Grady squeezed her shoulder. The sun slipped lower, and the house stood small and fierce beside the endless tracks. The wind carried stories in its breath, stories of war and winters past, of children lost and found. Somewhere someone would remember. A girl left barefoot in the snow. A man who said, "She sleeps in my home tonight," and meant it.